let us quickly go on to the outline of basically what we will cover during this short but very relevant module on ethical research. So first, I'm going to talk about the definition of research ethics. I will go through the historical background of research ethics because the present principles of research ethics that we practice today is actually the product of the historical milestones, both the good as well as the bad milestones that happened in research. We're going to talk about the guiding principles in research ethics, and hopefully we'll be able to identify the role of ethics in medical research. I will quickly go over the informed consent, and lastly, talk about what comprises research misconduct. Now, let's ask ourselves, what are research ethics? So let's begin with the definition of research. Research is a systematic gathering of information, of data, to learn about a certain topic, to identify patterns, to come up with treatments, to come up with clinical guidelines and recommendations. So ethics are a set of guidelines. They are a set of norms. They are a set of rules. Okay, so ethics are rules, guidelines, and norms that we are expected to follow. So under the concept of ethics, there are several synonyms. We have integrity, morals, principles, honesty, fairness, conscience, and fairness, just to mention a few keywords or synonyms which are related to ethics. Now, let's combine research and ethics. So when we talk about research ethics, this involves the application of fundamental ethical principles. So if you remember what ethics are, they are norms, they are rules, they are policies, they are guidelines. So when we apply these norms and rules to be followed to, number one, the planning, as well as the conduction and the publishing of research, then this now constitutes research ethics. So research ethics involves the application of fundamental ethical principles to the planning, to the conduction, as well as the publishing of research. Now, why is it important for us students as well as doctors to study ethics? And why should ethics be important in the research process? Number one, ethics would help us protect the rights of the people involved in the research. And these people involved in the research would include those who participate in the research. Let they be subjects, participants, or patients. And you have to remember that ethics provides a safeguard. It provides a check and a balance so that there will be no harm, not only to the participants, but also to the researcher and, of course, the community and the society in general. Because we have to remember, unethical research can harm people and it can harm communities. Now, unethical research can also lead to distrust, okay? And unethical research hinders the scientific process. Now, how would this concept of research ethics apply to you? How will it apply to me? So basically, ethics can be applied to all aspects of research. Number one, particularly how we interact and how we communicate with participants, how we collect, how we store, and how we report and interpret data or findings. So basically, all aspects of research basically needs a sound foundation of research ethics. Now, please allow me to go over this very detailed but very comprehensive timeline. Let me take you back into time as we go over the ethical research history. And I would like to repeat, the events that happened in the past set the foundations of what ethical research is today. So let's begin with Hippocrates. It was Hippocrates who was the first physician to define the principles of ethics when it comes to human research. Now, I want everyone to remember, he coined 4 principles of research in humans. And up to this very day, these same core principles are still valid today. So these are autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So I would like to remind everyone, this is something you have to memorize. What are the ethical principles of research in humans as coined by Hippocrates? Number 1, autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Okay, so please memorize these 4 ethical principles. Now, let's give a quick description of each of these ethical principles. So when we say autonomy, this means the respect we have for each participant, to respect the autonomy of that participant, the respect that we give that that participant is a human with rights and that that participant has his own decision-making capacity. We cannot force, we cannot coerce someone to participate in a research. We have to respect the principle of autonomy. Then we have beneficence, which means to act always in the best interests of the participant. And you have to remember, when we talk about beneficence, this means first do no harm. Primum non nocere. First do no harm. Then comes the concept of non-maleficence, which basically means to do as little harm as possible to the participant. So when we say beneficence, we want to conduct research, give a treatment, give an intervention that benefits the patient or benefits the participant, and benefits should always outweigh the risks. So in non-maleficence, we want to do as little harm. Again, first do no harm. And justice means to act fairly to all. And I will further discuss these. Now, after Hippocrates came Edward Jenner, who is considered to be the father of vaccination. So please remember, it was Edward Jenner who was the pioneer of vaccination against infectious diseases. He was the one who discovered the smallpox vaccine. And please take note, during this time, his research actually did not respect the principal rights of humans. Why? Because during this time, there were no existing guidelines or norms yet regarding the use of humans in research. Okay, but it is from here that history taught us and history educated us until we developed such respect for principal rights. Okay, next is Louis Pasteur, also considered to be the father of microbiology. He was the one who developed the process of sterilization, which is pasteurization. He's also the microbiologist and doctor who discovered the rabies vaccine. Now, Sir Louis Pasteur was studying animals first, and he understood that whatever information he generated from the research he conducted in animals was very important before exposing a human. So it is the concept of performing the test first on animals before on humans. So you have here some illustrations of how he utilized dogs to develop the rabies vaccine. And you have to remember, an urgent patient need was the reason for his first medical administration to humans in 1885. In other words, he began with animal experimentation until it led to utilizing humans for experiments. Now here, after Hippocrates, after Edward Jenner, after Louis Pasteur, came the famous Nuremberg Code of the Nazis. Then the Declaration of Helsinki, the National Research Act, the Belmont Report, and the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, heads up. 3 of these concepts came out in the actual physician's licensure examination here in the Philippines. So the Nuremberg Code I'm going to talk about, the Tuskegee, the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, the Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report, and the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, let's try to dissect this history and understand what happened. So the Nuremberg Code of the Germans dates way back to 1947. And the Nuremberg Code had these following core principles. Number 1, human consent is voluntary. Human consent is essential. That is the first principle of the Nuremberg Code. Now, as a physician, as a medical student, as an advocate of research, as someone conducting research, you have to know all of these principles. Number 1 principle, voluntary human consent is essential. Next, experimental results should result for the good for society. Anticipated results should justify the experiment. Avoid all unnecessary physical as well as mental suffering of the participants. There should be no experiment that is conducted which has the chance of death or disability. The next principle is to minimize the risk of subjects, to facilitate the protection of all these subjects, and that experiments can only be conducted by qualified persons. Only those who have the qualifications, both academic skills and professional qualifications, should be the ones conducting experiments. And very important is that the subject can withdraw at any time during the course of a research. And lastly, the last principle in the Nuremberg Code is to terminate the experiment if results are known, that's one, or to terminate the experiment with best judgment. So once you get the results, the experiment should be terminated. Once you see that there is something negative, harmful, not only to the individual, to the participants, and to society, then it should be with your best judgment as the head researcher or being part of the research team to terminate that said research. So again, everyone has to be familiar with the Nuremberg Code. 1947, the Nazis, the Germans. Now next, after the Nuremberg Code, was the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, where researchers utilized groups of African Americans and did not disclose the real purpose of the said study. So the Tuskegee syphilis study violated the core principles of research ethics. And this was way back in 1932 when the US Public Health Services conducted the Tuskegee syphilis study, and patients were not told that they had syphilis. Can you imagine that? The patients were not told, it was not disclosed that they had syphilis. And during this time, a vulnerable population were the subjects, and these were the African Americans. And you have to remember, during this study, patients were deceived. Can you imagine that? They were coerced, they were forced, and they were treated unjustly because this group of researchers basically wanted to observe the natural progress of the disease. Now, please type in the chat box. Do you think this deception, coercion, and unjust treatment, do you think this is unethical? Okay, so do you think that this is unethical? So please type in your answers. Okay, just that, those words: deception, coercion, and unjust treatment. So this is what I want you to understand. You will not appreciate where we are today with research ethics unless you understand the historical milestones. So from Hippocrates the Nuremberg Code. And here comes a violation of research ethics with the Tuskegee study. Now look at this headline. Syphilis victims in the United States study went untreated for 40 years. Treatment was withheld, and the patients did not know that there was already a treatment, which in this case was penicillin, that was discovered. Now, this is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and I want you to see what happened. The experiment began in 1932. So they recruited African-American patients. They basically had syphilis. They were not told they had the disease. Penicillin was established as a treatment as early as 1945, and even to this day, the drug of choice for the treatment of syphilis is penicillin. This experiment ended in 1972. Can you just imagine that? 40 years and treatment was withheld. These participants were deceived. These participants were prevented from obtaining a life-saving penicillin because the researchers wanted to observe the natural course of the disease. So this is the Tuskegee, syphilis experiment. And what happened? Look, the Nuremberg Code was established way back in 1947, and this was established after penicillin was discovered, and this Tuskegee study was already ongoing. And look, it was only at the end of the experiment when it hit the newspapers. Backlash. A year after, the US government now had to settle with survivors and their families the damages that were done. And it was only in 1997 when the US government apologized for such violation of research ethics. Now, after the Tuskegee is the thalidomide scandal. Now, the thalidomide scandal goes back all the way to 1961. These pictures that you see here are examples of phocomelia, which are the deformities associated, the limb deformities associated with this drug, thalidomide. Now, let me give you a quick history of the thalidomide scandal. This drug, thalidomide, was synthesized in West Germany way back in 1954. So this is after the Tuskegee study. It was marketed, binenta na, as well as made available to patients from 1957 to 1962. But take note, this drug was not licensed. And in fact, this is the tagline for thalidomide, the wonder drug. It was hailed as the wonder drug that provided safe, sound sleep. However, when taken during pregnancy, this is associated with birth malformations as well as stillborn. So it causes fetal malformations as well as fetal death. These are the common manifestations. So we have deafness, blindness, disfigurement, and the cleft palate. So this drug was toxic when taken during pregnancy. Now, the question is this: did the pharmaceuticals inform the public that this drug had toxic effects? The answer is no. And that is why the public continued to take this drug, because the safety and efficacy and toxigenicity of this drug was not made known to the public. So this is the thalidomide tragedy. So look at all these deformities. Okay, look at these. So these are actual pictures of survivors and patients affected by thalidomide. Okay, and after this tragedy, a year after, came the famous Kefauver-Harris Amendment. So basically, the thalidomide tragedy was 1961. Then a year after, President John F. Kennedy, along with Senator Kefauver and Harris, made a law and amendment. And this is the famous Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which now mandates, kailangan na, drug manufacturers to demonstrate efficacy as well as the safety of their drugs. And this is the reason why our present Food and Drug Authority, or the FDA, can now withdraw the approval of a drug even if that drug has already been marketed. And it is now the FDA that regulates not only the regulation, but as well as the evaluation of drug testing by pharmaceuticals. A drug should not pass and reach the general public unless that responsible pharmaceutical company evaluates that drug as to efficacy and safety. Okay, and you see these series of events. One milestone, whether good or bad, but usually the bad ones, leads to another milestone, which gives an improvement with regards to research ethics. Now, then came in 1964, the famous, everyone has to memorize this, the Declaration of Helsinki. You will not become a clinical trialist, reach clinical trials as a researcher or even a research assistant unless you know these core concepts. So in 1964, the World Medical Association gathered several countries and they penned the Declaration of Helsinki. Now, everyone has to know the basic principles of the Declaration of Helsinki. One, to conform to accepted scientific principles, adequate experimentation, and scientific literature. You can no longer conduct research which is out of the blue if it does not have a scientific basis. It has to have a clearly formulated protocol, and it can only be conducted by scientifically competent, medically qualified persons or under the supervision of these scientifically competent individuals. The risk and the benefits now have to be weighed, okay, and go back to the core principles, ethical principles of Hippocrates, the core principles of non-maleficence and beneficence. So risk and benefits. The benefits should outweigh the risks. Then another basic principle of the Declaration of Helsinki is that subjects, their rights have to be protected and safeguarded. Subjects' right to safeguard integrity. There has to be accuracy of results with regards to the publications released. There has to be a sound and ethical informed consent, and the research protocol must contain a statement of the ethical considerations involved. So these are the core principles of the Declaration of Helsinki. And after the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, came the famous Belmont Report in 1979. Now, I apologize if this travel down memory lane bores you, all of these principles and historical milestones recently popped out in the physician's licensure exam. And you will not become a clinical researcher unless you know these concepts. So then came the Belmont Report, which is actually the ethical principles and guidelines for protection of human subjects of research. Now, these are the three core principles I want you to memorize regarding the Belmont Report. So we have respect for persons, we have beneficence, then we have justice. So again, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Now, under respect for persons, this is where individual autonomy must exist. This is when the informed consent comes in. The informed consent helps safeguard our respect for persons. And this principle of respect for persons should protect vulnerable groups. Now, examples of vulnerable groups will be minors, those who are not of legal age, pregnant patients, elderly, those who are mentally retarded, those who might have insanity, okay, those who belong to cultural or tribal minorities. So we have to protect vulnerable groups. Then comes the principle of beneficence, where, take note of this, do no harm. We have to maximize benefits and minimize harm, not only to persons, but as well as to society. So please take note of that. So again, the three core principles under the Belmont Report: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Now, for respect for people, remember, we have to acknowledge autonomy. We have to protect individuals with reduced or diminished autonomy. And these are the vulnerable population. So as mentioned earlier, children, those who are mentally retarded, those who are pregnant, those who are elderly, those who are or belong to indigenous groups. Okay, so we have to respect people. Now, after the Belmont Report, there were federal regulations that were derived from it. And this is what we call the common rule. So memorize this. So under the common rule, or the federal regulations which emanated from the Belmont Principle or the Belmont Report, research now has to be reviewed by an institutional review board. That's an IRB, or some hospitals call it IERB. So Institutional Ethics and Review Board. That means you are not allowed to conduct a study or a research unless it passes through your institution, your school, your company, IRB. There has to be informed consent of participants, and there has to be assurances, institutional assurances of compliance. Okay, so that is known as the common rule. Then came the CIOMS, which was penned in 1993 and further amended in 2002. So CIOMS stands for the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences. Remember, you cannot achieve a certificate of good clinical practice, or GCP, to be an investigator or a researcher in a clinical trial unless you go through this historical timeline. So what was the purpose of the CIOMS guidelines? So the CIOMS guidelines basically would indicate as well as advise how ethical principles, which are basic and fundamental, can be applied in different situations worldwide, with consideration of cultures, traditions, as well as religion, considering socioeconomic circumstances, whether the study is conducted in a developed country, developing country, low income or low to middle income country. National legal and administrative contexts are considered, as well as the implementation of the previous principles of the Declaration of Helsinki. So this is the purpose of the CIOMS guidelines. Then we are now here to the present day, where we have the famous ICH, which stands for the International Conference on Harmonization. So again, what does ICH mean? So it means the International, Conference, International Conference on Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Registration of Pharmaceutical Use in Humans. So please take note of this. Then we have here the GCP, or the Guideline on Good Clinical Practice. When you go into residency training here in our country, you have to take note that the first year residents are required to be GCP certified to ensure that when they conduct their research as medical students, as trainees, as residents rather, then they should know basically basic ethical principles in research. So this is the mission of the ICH, or International Conference on Harmonization, and that is protection of public health, to achieve greater harmonization worldwide, And that is, of course, with regards to developing, registering, and distributing quality pharmaceuticals or high quality medications. Now, under the ICH guidelines, there are 4 categories. I will require you to study this, and this is your mnemonics, QSEM. So this is what everyone has to remember. Q means quality guidelines, S means safety guidelines, E means efficacy guidelines, M means multidisciplinary guidelines. So what are the 4 categories, of the ICH guidelines? 1 is quality, 2nd is safety, 3rd is efficacy, last is multidisciplinary guidelines. So just remember QSEM. Now, these are the reasons why guidelines for good clinical practice was created. Number 1 is to increase ethical awareness. 2nd is to improve the methods in which clinical trials are conducted. 3rd is such that clinical trials would be better understood. Next is to consider public and political concern over safety aspects, to identify as well as report, as well as prevent fraud and accidents during trials, and of course, to contribute to growing research, as well as understand better development costs, to consider increasing competition, because if one pharmaceutical, there's another pharmaceutical, then there has to be fair competition. And lastly, mutual recognition of data. That means the pharmaceuticals release the data, the public, the FDA, the regulating agencies accept the data, this data reaches the public, and basically this creates a harmonization worldwide. So these are the 13 principles of the GCP. You have to be familiar with this. So first principle is the ethical principle. Second is risk-benefit. So ethical principles, risk-benefit, subject protection, adequate data, protocols, having a review by the institutional review or the institutional ethics committee review, medical care, qualified staff, informed consent, proper and confidential record keeping, confidentiality, quality assurance and investigational product, and lastly, quality assurance. These are the 13 principles of the GCP. So everything is here. So please take time to go over this when you receive your digital handouts, okay? So going over everything that has happened from the time of the oath of Hippocrates, 4 basic ethical principles of human research came the Nuremberg Code, then the Kefauver-Harris Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report, and insert there the Tuskegee study and the thalidomide tragedy. Then came the ICH guidelines in GCP